Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Autumn had arrived in Brookville, bringing with it the crisp air of colorful mornings, the scent of fallen leaves, and the hushed atmosphere of the first classes of the year. Sunlight streamed through the large windows of Central High School, illuminating the hallways bustling with students in their immaculate uniforms. Among them was 16-year-old Jasmine Carter, a bright and perceptive student, walking with a dignified posture despite the sometimes intense stares of her classmates. Her caramel skin, hazel eyes, and curly hair framed a face marked by determination and serenity. Jasmine entered her new literature class with a slight, polite smile, her backpack slung neatly over one shoulder. She had heard rumors about Ms. Elizabeth Walker, a teacher renowned for her academic excellence, but also for her strictness and strong opinions about certain students. The moment Jasmine crossed the threshold, Ms. Walker looked up from her desk, scrutinizing her like a detective assessing a suspect. "Hello, Jasmine," she said in a voice that was meant to be warm but was tinged with suspicion. "Have a seat." Jasmine obeyed, taking her place in the front row, consciously choosing a seat that placed her within sight of the teacher, but not too close to avoid any immediate confrontation. From the very beginning of class, Ms. Walker asked incisive questions. Each of Jasmine's perfectly articulated and thoughtful answers seemed to irritate the teacher more than impress her. The other students watched the scene with a certain unease. They could feel the electric tension in the room, that mixture of respect and silent fear that enveloped Jasmine. "Interesting, Jasmine, but can you really back up this idea with concrete evidence?" asked Ms. Walker, a frosty smile on her lips. Jasmine, without losing her composure, replied confidently. "Of course, Mrs. Walker. According to Whitman's text, it is obvious that." The teacher frowned, visibly annoyed by Jasmine's composure. The next few minutes were a flurry of trick questions and precise answers. Each time Jasmine answered correctly, a slight frown appeared on Ms. Walker's face, a sign that the young student was slipping away from her. At the back of the classroom, a few students exchanged incredulous glances. No one dared to applaud or comment, but they all sensed that something unfair was happening. Jasmine, for her part, clutched her notebooks tightly, but her gaze betrayed a strong inner confidence. What Ms. Walker didn't know at all was that Jasmine wasn't an ordinary student. She was the daughter of Michael Carter, the high school principal, a respected, strict but fair man who had built his reputation on integrity and leadership. Michael Carter had always taught his daughter that respect isn't something you beg for and that injustices should be faced calmly and intelligently, not through brute confrontation. As the class drew to a close, Ms. Walker cast a final glance at Jasmine, a defiant glint in her eyes. Jasmine, for her part, returned a calm but determined look. A silent battle had begun, a battle where words, knowledge, and dignity would be the only weapons. And in that high school bathed in autumnal light, no one yet suspected that Mrs. Walker's choices that day would trigger a series of events that she would remember for the rest of her life. The day after the start of term, the atmosphere in the literature classroom was already tense. Jasmine entered, her school bag neatly hung, her notebooks perfectly aligned. She could already feel the heavy gaze of Mrs. Elizabeth Walker, seated behind her desk, a cold but calculating smile on her lips. "Hello, Jasmine," said Ms. Walker, her voice as sharp as a razor. "I hope you're ready to participate today." Jasmine nodded politely, but inwardly, her mind was preparing with patience and vigilance. She knew that every word, every gesture could be analyzed, distorted, and used against her. The first few minutes of the lesson were ordinary, but as soon as the discussion turned to a poem by Robert Frost, Mrs. Walker stared at Jasmine with an almost aggressive intensity. "Jasmine, why do you think this poem expresses the loneliness of modern man?" she asked, in a tone that seemed innocent but hid a clear intention, to trap. Jasmine replied calmly. "Because the poet uses images of isolated paths and metaphors of distance to show inner isolation, Ms. Walker." A silence followed her answer. The other students watched her, fascinated by her composure, while Mrs. Walker frowned, visibly upset. Interesting," the teacher murmured, in a tone that meant the opposite. "But can we really call it isolation?" Perhaps you're mistaken, Jasmine. You should check your sources before making such claims. Jasmine clenched her fists slightly under her desk, but her voice remained calm. I did it, Ms. Walker. I can show you my notes if you'd like. The teacher looked away, unable to answer. For the first time, she felt a shiver of uncertainty in the face of the young girl she thought she could easily intimidate. At the end of class, Ms. Walker asked Jasmine to stay after the bell rang. The other students left the room, leaving behind the stifling, silent atmosphere. Jasmine, began Mrs. Walker, her voice lower but still icy. I think you should review some of your study methods. You seem too confident, sometimes it backfires. Jasmine, standing opposite her, replied calmly. I work hard, Ms. Walker, and I always do my best. If anything doesn't seem right to you, I can show you my references. The teacher looked away, feeling an unease she hadn't anticipated. She had always been used to dominating her students, controlling the discussions. Here, facing Jasmine, that habit was cracking. Before leaving the room, Jasmine murmured to herself. One day, you will understand that arrogance is not enough. As she walked down the hall, she felt a new energy coursing through her, a certainty that her parents, especially her father Michael Carter, the school principal, would never tolerate this kind of injustice. A silent battle had begun, and Jasmine knew she had to be ready to fight it with intelligence and dignity. The next morning, the air was heavy in the high school. The corridors buzzed with conversations, laughter, and the clatter of lockers, but for Jasmine, each footstep seemed to echo with vigilance. She knew that Ms. Walker was already waiting for her in the literature room, her eyes sharp as razor blades. As soon as she entered, the teacher stared intently at her. Jasmine, it's you again, she said with a cold smile. I hope you're ready to participate today, but try not to mess up too badly. Jasmine nodded silently, settling into her usual seat. She knew that everything she did would be observed, scrutinized, and potentially used against her. The other students exchanged worried glances, aware of the tension between the teacher and Jasmine. During the analysis of a Shakespeare text, Mrs. Walker interrupted the young girls several times, rolling her eyes at each correct answer. No, Jasmine. I don't think that's correct, she said sharply. Read the passage again, you must have misunderstood. Jasmine calmly replied. I have read it carefully, Mrs. Walker. Allow me to explain how I interpreted its meaning. The teacher frowned, visibly irritated that her attempt at humiliation had failed. She approached Jasmine's desk, retrieved her notebook, and quickly flipped through it. You really overestimate yourself, Jasmine, she murmured in a low voice, but loud enough for Jasmine to hear. Perhaps you need a reminder of what your place is here. A shiver ran through Jasmine, but she didn't let it show. Her hands remained firm on her notebook, her eyes fixed on the teacher with calm and determination. She knew that an impulsive reaction could be detrimental. When the bell rang to signal the end of class, Ms. Walker spoke to Jasmine. Stay here. We need to talk. Jasmine's heart was beating a little faster, but she remained calm. Very well, Mrs. Walker, she replied politely. As soon as the other students left the room, Ms. Walker turned towards her, arms crossed. Jasmine, you've got a lot of nerve for a student. Believe me, many of your classmates would love to be in your shoes, but you seem to think you're different. Jasmine took a deep breath and replied in a clear voice. I'm just doing my best, Ms. Walker. I don't believe I'm any different. The tension rose a notch. Mrs. Walker, visibly frustrated, slammed her pen on the desk. Do you really think your hard work is enough to protect you? She said, with an implied threat in her voice. At that moment, Jasmine discreetly took out her phone and dialed a speed dial number. A few seconds later, a deep, reassuring voice answered. Jasmine? Is everything all right? It was his father, Michael Carter. Jasmine murmurs. Yes, Dad, but Mrs. Walker is getting really difficult. A spark of pride and anger rose within her. She knew now that the situation would have to be handled carefully, but that she was no longer alone. The intervention of her father, direct and respected, would soon change the dynamic and show Mrs. Walker that arrogance and prejudice could clash with dignity and family power. The chapter ends on this cliffhanger. The confrontation is not yet public, but the groundwork is laid for the revelation that will come in the next chapter. The next morning, the high school seemed to exude a deceptive tranquility. But for Ms. Walker, a dull tension had been with her since the previous day. She knew that Jasmine had contacted her father, and this idea caused her a new unease. She had always been in control in her class, and now, something was slipping from her grasp. Shortly after the students arrived, Ms. Walker was summoned to the principal's office without explanation. Her heart was beating faster than usual. She entered and greeted him politely. "Hello, Michael." The director looked up from his files. His gaze, still calm and imposing, fixed on Mrs. Walker with an intensity that made the teacher shudder. "Elizabeth, please sit down," he said in a calm but firm voice. Ms. Walker complied, trying to hide her discomfort behind a forced smile. "I wanted to talk to you about Jasmine," she began, in a tone that was meant to sound confident. Michael Carter stared at her for a few seconds, his gaze piercing. Then, slowly, he said, "Jasmine is my daughter." The world seemed to stop for Mrs. Walker. She paled, her throat tightened. What?" she stammered, unable to hide her panic. "Yes, Elizabeth," the headmaster continued, without raising his voice but with an authority that made any debate impossible. "The girl you have bullied and humiliated since the beginning of the year, is Jasmine." Mrs. Walker felt a mixture of shame and fear wash over her. All her judgments and remarks, which once seemed to her to be proof of her authority, turned against her like sharp arrows. I didn't know," she murmured, but Michael Carter cut her off with a calm gesture. "You knew exactly what you were doing," he said simply. "And yet, you chose to attack a student for no reason, based on your personal and unfair judgment." Mrs. Walker lowered her eyes. She then understood the magnitude of her mistake. Her years of control and arrogance had just crumbled in a few sentences. Michael Carter continued. "From now on, all your interactions with Jasmine will be monitored. If you do not respect this commitment, disciplinary action will be taken. Understood?" The teacher nodded silently, unable to utter a word. She felt the weight of her own guilt pressing down on her like an overwhelming burden. A few moments later, Jasmine entered the office, calm but proud. She greeted her father with a nod, then turned her gaze towards Mrs. Walker. "Good morning, Ms. Walker," she said calmly. "I believe you now know who you're dealing with." Mrs. Walker couldn't answer. Her face betrayed a mixture of embarrassment, fear, and shame. She had underestimated Jasmine because of her color and her age, but now she had to face the truth: arrogance had a price, and dignity could reverse power in moments. That day, an essential lesson was learned: prejudice and intimidation can never prevail over truth and justice. Jasmine, protected yet also strong, had shown that even in the face of injustice, patience and courage can transform the fear of others into irreversible lessons. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Brookville High School had changed drastically. The story of the confrontation between Ms. Walker and Principal Michael Carter had spread through the halls, subtly but firmly, by word of mouth from students and teachers who had witnessed it. Jasmine continued to attend her classes with her usual dignity. Every step she took seemed to affirm her newfound confidence. The classmates who had previously hesitated to support her now looked at her with respect. Even the students who had whispered or laughed behind her back were more cautious. Ms. Walker, meanwhile, had become a shadow of her former self. Her interactions with Jasmine were strictly professional, but she could no longer ignore the shame that gnawed at her. Her colleagues sensed her unease and waning arrogance, and for the first time, she felt the weight of her own mistakes. One afternoon, as Jasmine was leaving her classroom, she passed Mrs. Walker in the hallway. The teacher looked down, visibly embarrassed. Jasmine stopped and gave her a slight smile, not arrogantly, but calmly and serenely. "You know, Mrs. Walker," Jasmine said softly, "respect isn't decreed, it's earned." And sometimes, the most important lessons come from those we underestimate. Ms. Walker remained silent, unable to find an answer. She simply nodded, a mixture of shame and gratitude crossing her face. She finally understood that her prejudices and her desire for domination had been her greatest enemy. Meanwhile, Michael Carter continued to monitor the situation discreetly, but proud of how his daughter had handled it. Jasmine had faced the injustice calmly and intelligently, and had transformed a potentially humiliating situation into a victory of dignity. In the following weeks, Jasmine became an example to the students at the high school. Her patience, composure, and courage were now admired by all. She had proven that true strength lies not in intimidation or cruelty, but in perseverance, knowledge, and dignity. For her part, Ms. Walker learned to moderate her judgments and treat each student with respect. The humiliation she had inflicted was a lesson she would never forget: power misused always turns against the one who abuses it. The high school returned to its normal rhythm, but for Jasmine, this experience had left a deep mark. She had understood that true strength lies in patience, determination, and the ability to transform injustice into a lesson for others. And as autumn continued to paint Brookville with its warm colors, Jasmine walked through the halls, head held high, heart light and mind ready to face whatever challenges the future might hold.